Most people think the corner game is just another internet ritual. A creepy challenge teenagers try at sleepovers before someone laughs and turns the lights back on. But the strange thing is, versions of this game existed long before the internet. In Japan, there are stories about travelers trapped in mountain shelters during snowstorms, walking in circles through the night to stay awake and avoid freezing to death. Some survivors later claimed they heard an extra set of footsteps among them, not louder, not clearer, just there. South Korea has its own version. In parts of Taiwan and China, students passed whispered rules between classrooms. 4 corners, 4 people, keep moving, never stop counting. And somehow, no matter which country the story comes from, the warning is always almost identical. If, at any point, you become certain there are 5 people inside the room, do not turn around. Because according to the legend, the moment you acknowledge the 5th person, the game changes. There are different versions of the rules, but they all start the same way. A room, 4 corners, 4 people. No furniture in the middle, no distractions. Just space and silence that feels a little too deliberate, like the room is waiting to see what you'll do with it. Each person stands in a corner as go out. And then the movement begins. One person walks to the next corner. A tap on the shoulder, that's how you pass the turn. If the corner is empty, you cough once, just once, and keep moving. That's it. That's the structure. But what people don't talk about is how quickly structure starts to fall apart in the dark. At first, everyone is sure of the rhythms. You can hear it. Soft steps, a tap, a cough, then movement again. Almost mechanical, almost safe. Then something shifts. Not loudly, not all at once. Just a fraction of hesitation between steps. A delay where there shouldn't be one. A tap that lands a little too soft, or a cough that comes half a second too late. And in that space, the mind starts doing something it shouldn't. It starts filling in gaps. And once the gaps are filled, it becomes very hard to tell who is actually moving in the room anymore. Nobody agrees on when it actually begins to go wrong. Some say it's the moment someone coughs twice. Others say it's earlier, when you start recognizing a pattern that doesn't quite repeat correctly, even though it should. In theory, 4 people moving in a square should always return to the same rhythm, same distance, same sequence. But in practice, people are unreliable in the dark. Breathing changes. Memory slips. Someone moves too early because they think they heard a tap that never happened. Someone else freezes for half a second too long because they weren't sure if it was their turn. And the room doesn't correct you. It just keeps going. That's usually the first sign people mention afterward, if they ever talk about it at all. A quiet, growing uncertainty about how many rounds have actually passed. Because at some point, the counting stops matching the movement. And once that happens, every step starts to feel like it might belong to someone else. And that's when people start hearing it. The extra step. Not behind them, not ahead. Somewhere in between. Most descriptions never agree on what the extra presence actually sounds like. Some remember it as a heavier step. Others insist it was lighter than the rest. Almost careful. Like whoever it belonged to was trying not to be noticed. But the strangest detail is consistency. Not in what people heard, but in when they noticed it. It never arrives. It's already there. Somewhere around the 3rd or 4th round, a kind of doubt starts to settle in. Someone will pause mid-step, not because they were told to, but because something about the rhythm feels slightly overcrowded. As if the room has more movement than it should be able to hold. And then the counting begins to fail in a different way. Not by losing numbers, but by gaining them. A tap that doesn't match a known direction. A cough that comes from a corner no one remembers reaching. Footsteps that seem to complete a circle before anyone physically gets there. At that point, most people assume it's just panic, the mind filling silence with pattern. But in almost every version of the story, there is a moment, small, almost dismissible, when someone says it out loud. "There are 4 of us." A pause. And then, without exception, someone else replies, "No." That single correction changes everything. Because once someone denies the count, the room stops behaving like a simple space with 4 corners. It stops being a geometry problem you can walk your way out of. People who've described it afterward always struggle with the same part. It's the loss of certainty about where everyone is standing. In normal conditions, you can anchor yourself. You know the 3 others. Even in darkness, the body builds a map. But in the corner game, that map starts to shift without permission. A shoulder you thought belonged to one person feels wrong on second contact. A familiar voice sounds slightly delayed, as if it's arriving from a different angle than it should. Someone answers too quickly. Someone else doesn't answer at all, even though they should be directly in front of you. And then comes the moment nobody forgets. Not the appearance of something new, but the realization that one of the existing positions no longer makes sense. Because in a 4-corner room, there are only supposed to be 4 paths of movement. But once the rhythm breaks, you start getting 5. A lot of people imagine the 5th person as some kind of shadow figure standing in the dark. But that's rarely how the stories describe it. In most accounts, nobody actually sees anyone. That's what makes it worse. The fear comes from implication, creeping awareness that the room is producing outcomes that shouldn't be possible if only 4 people are inside. One version from an old Japanese forum described a player reaching an empty corner, coughing once like the rules required, only to hear another cough answer back from directly beside them. Another story claims someone completed a full circuit around the room and briefly brushed shoulders with a person they had already passed seconds earlier, behind them, as if the order of movement had folded in on itself. And strangely, many of these stories share another detail people don't usually mention until much later. The room begins to feel larger. Not visually. Most players can barely see anything by that point. But the distance between corners subtly changes. Steps take longer. The silence between taps stretches wider. Walls feel farther away than they should be. Like the room is quietly making space for someone else. And according to the legend, once the room does that, the game is no longer being played by 4 people. What's interesting is that the corner game doesn't belong to one country anymore. The modern internet version is usually linked to East Asia, especially Japan, where stories about looping spaces and hidden presences have existed for decades. Some versions involve mountain shelters during blizzards. Others take place in abandoned schools, apartments, or empty classrooms after dark. But even outside Asia, the structure feels strangely familiar. Western paranormal folklore has its own versions of movement rituals, games where participants must continue walking, continue following rules that slowly become harder to trust. There's the midnight game, where players move through a dark house to avoid something following them. The 3 Kings ritual involves mirrors, fixed positions, and the fear of acknowledging the wrong presence in the room. Even older seance traditions from Victorian Europe carried similar warnings. Never break the circle, never stop midway, and never react to the extra guest. Different countries, different rituals, but somehow they all circle back to the same idea: a closed room, and the growing feeling that, at some point in the dark, the number of people inside quietly changes. What makes the corner game unsettling isn't just the idea of ghosts. It's how believable the experience becomes once you strip away the supernatural explanation. Psychologists have pointed out that repetitive movement in darkness can distort spatial awareness surprisingly quickly. Human beings rely heavily on visual anchors to understand distance and position. Remove those anchors. Add repetition, silence, and expectation, and the brain starts compensating on its own. That's where things like phantom footsteps can appear. A delayed echo gets interpreted as another person. A slight timing error turns into the feeling that someone moved when they shouldn't have. Over time, the group slowly loses confidence in the shared layout of the room. And once that certainty breaks down, paranoia spreads fast. Because every sound suddenly needs to be identified. But even with the psychological explanation, there's still one detail that keeps resurfacing in almost every version of the story. People don't describe the extra presence as random. They describe it as patient, almost like it's waiting for the group to make a mistake, to stop moving, to lose count. Because according to the ritual, the moment the fifth person is recognized in the room, it finally gets a place in the room. There's another reason these rituals continue spreading online, even now. They exploit something deeply human, our dependence on patterns. The corner game only works because the rules are simple enough for your brain to automate. After a few rounds, people stop consciously thinking about the movement. The body takes over. And that's exactly when perception becomes unreliable. Researchers studying isolation and sensory deprivation have documented cases where perfectly healthy people began detecting extra voices, movements, or even entire presences nearby after long periods of repetition and darkness. Explorers trapped in snowstorms, sailors alone at sea, climbers stranded on mountains. Many described the exact same sensation. Someone else was with them. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the third man syndrome, or strange coping response, where the brain creates another presence during extreme stress or disorientation. But the corner game twists that idea into something much darker. Because unlike accidental isolation, this ritual is deliberate. 4 people willingly enter a controlled pattern, over and over, until the room itself begins to feel unstable. And once every participant starts doubting the same space at the same time, the fear becomes contagious. One post from a Japanese forum described a group of university students attempting the ritual inside an abandoned music classroom. According to the story, nothing happened for nearly 20 minutes. The players were actually getting bored. One of them even started laughing during the rotations. Then someone coughed from the wrong corner. Not loudly, not aggressively. Just a quiet cough from a position that should have been empty. The post ended there. No explanations. Just a final line written several hours later. I don't think we started with the right number of people. Another story from a Korean paranormal board described a player repeatedly feeling a shoulder in the dark that didn't match anyone's clothing. The others were wearing short sleeves. The shoulder they touched felt like wet wool. After the game ended, the group turned the lights back on and counted themselves 3 separate times before leaving the room. Not because someone was missing. Because for a few seconds, they genuinely thought there were still 5 people standing there. Western reports tend to describe the experience differently, less focused on ghosts. But somehow, they arrive at almost the same fear. One account posted on a paranormal forum in the early 2010s came from a group of friends in northern England who tried recreating the corner game after reading about it online. According to the post, the first half hour felt completely normal, just people walking in darkness, occasionally laughing at how seriously everyone was taking it. Then one of them noticed something strange. The footsteps no longer matched the number of people moving. At first they assumed it was echoes bouncing through the house, but the sound kept repeating in a pattern that felt too deliberate to ignore. 4 people would move, but 5 sets of impacts seemed to cross the floorboards. The writer described it as hearing one extra person trying to stay perfectly between everyone else's timing. Another story came from an American thread discussing the so-called midnight games. A participant claimed the room gradually began feeling physically incorrect, like the corners were drifting farther apart every time they completed another rotation. What unsettled them most wasn't seeing anything unusual. It was losing the ability to picture where the others actually were. At one point, someone spoke directly beside them in the dark. A second later, the same voice answered from across the room. The group immediately turned the lights on and stopped the ritual. But according to the post, one detail still bothered them afterward. When the lights came back, everyone was already facing the same corner. And that detail appears more often than people realize. The corner. Just one specific corner that gradually starts feeling wrong. Players describe avoiding it without consciously meaning to, looking past it too quickly, feeling relieved whenever their turn moves them away from it again. In some stories, that corner even seems farther away than the others, despite the room supposedly being symmetrical. Psychologists would probably explain this as pattern fixation. Once the brain labels part of a dark environment as threatening, attention keeps returning to it automatically. But folklore has a different interpretation. According to some versions of the ritual, the fifth person never walks around the room at all. It stays still, waiting in the empty corner, which means the extra footsteps people hear may not belong to the presence itself. They belong to everyone else unconsciously trying to avoid where it's standing. And maybe that's why so many stories end the same way, because nobody wants to be the next person forced to walk toward that corner again. There's also a reason rituals like this survive for so long, even in an age where almost everything can be explained, recorded, or debunked within hours. They operate in a space that's difficult to verify, just shared memory inside darkness. And memory becomes unreliable surprisingly fast when fear enters the equation. That's what makes the corner game different from most internet horror stories. The ritual doesn't ask players to see something impossible. In fact, many versions specifically warn against looking too carefully. Instead, it relies on uncertainty. A sound you can't confidently identify. A movement that may have happened slightly too early. The creeping suspicion that the room's layout no longer matches the one you entered minutes ago. And once a group begins doubting the same space together, the experience feeds itself. One person hesitates. Another notices the hesitation. Someone hears an extra step. By then, the ritual no longer feels like four individuals moving separately through darkness. It feels like the room itself has developed a rhythm of its own. A rhythm that doesn't need all four players anymore to continue. There's a point in almost every version of the story where someone tries to break the loop. That quiet, animal sense that something about the situation has stopped being reversible. They stop walking. Or they refuse to move when it's their turn. Sometimes they speak. Sometimes they just freeze in place and listen, waiting for the room to correct itself back into something normal. But it doesn't. Instead, the others keep going. The rhythm continues, as if the missing person was still participating somewhere just outside of perception. The taps still land. The footsteps still arrive. The sequence doesn't collapse. If you've made it this far, then you already know this isn't just a story about a game. It's about how easily a space can stop making sense when you stop trusting it. And once you notice that, it tends to stay with you longer than you expect. If you want more cases like this, urban legends, ritual stories, and things that sit just outside what people call real, subscribe to Whispers Beyond Archives. And tell me in the comments how many corners you think your room has tonight. Just don't double check too many times.